What if I told you the biggest break of a musician's life led to him becoming the industry's favorite punching bag? John Corabi replaced an iconic frontman, recorded what many consider to be the band's most ambitious album, and was then methodically erased from the official story. They tossed him out without a word, wiped his contributions from their next record, and then pretended he never existed in their Hollywood biopic. Here's how John Corabi's dream job with Mötley Crüe became a 5-year nightmare that almost ended his career.
Like, subscribe. Thank you.
John Corabi came from a place where you learn to swallow your pain. He grew up in Philadelphia, born into a working-class Italian-American family that wasn't big on emotional displays. When he was 10, his parents split, leaving his mom to juggle 2 jobs just to keep food on the table for him and his 2 siblings. Life was already tough, but then something happened that would shadow him for decades. 12 years old, he walked in on his own uncle abusing his younger brother. And it was a moment of profound, unspeakable trauma, and the family's response was just pure silence. Chose to bury it, pretend it never happened. A coping mechanism that Corabi would later see echoed in the cold machinery of the music business. And for a kid with a universe of unspoken rage and hurt inside of him, music became the only way out, a release valve, a place to scream the things he could not say. So John teaches himself to play guitar and sing, pouring all that unprocessed grief into his voice. And it was his survival. Spent his early 20s bouncing around between odd jobs, playing in local Philly bands, honing that powerful blues-drenched voice that was so different from the high-pitched wails of the 80s rock scene. And his first real shot was a band called Angora, which started to get some local buzz. But like so many young bands, it fell apart under the weight of its own personal problems, drug use among the members. The dream felt like it was slipping away. So what he did was what countless musicians before him had done. Packed his bags, split to LA. In 1989, he forms a new band, initially called Saints or Sinners, with some serious talent. He's got former Racer X members Bruce Bouillet on guitar and Juan Alderete on the bass. They briefly had Scott Travis on drums before he got a call he couldn't refuse from Judas Priest. With a new drummer, Walt Woodward III, they renamed themselves The Scream. They landed a deal with Hollywood Records and got the legendary Eddie Kramer, the man who had engineered for Jimi Hendrix and Led Zeppelin, to produce their debut album. The result, Let It Scream, released in 1991, was a freaking monster. And to my viewers, I'm just going to tell you that I think that that's one of the most underrated albums from that period. It was friggin' powerful, bluesy, hard rock, completely out of step with the fading glam scene. Corabi's vocals were the centerpiece. Dude had a freaking range, fierce, gritty, full of that emotion that he'd been channeling. Tracks like Outlaw, Man in the Moon were killer. Critics loved it, had all the makings of a breakthrough, but their timing could not have been worse, unfortunately. As their album hit the shelves, a cultural tidal wave called grunge was crashing over from Seattle. Nirvana, Pearl Jam, changing the entire landscape practically overnight. And it's a shame too, because great bands like this one also ended up getting washed up in the tide. The Scream's classic, well-crafted rock sound was suddenly seen as outdated, a relic from a bygone era, when in all truth it was fresh as hell, but I digress. The album stalled, failing to make a significant commercial dent. It was another case of being so close yet so far. By then, a phone call changed everything, because back in the Mötley Crüe camp, all hell was breaking loose. In 1992, the band had a very public, ugly split with their iconic frontman Vince Neil. Nikki Sixx, the band's bassist and primary songwriter, had happened to hear the Scream's album and had publicly praised it. In a moment of pure serendipity, Corabi decided to call Sixx's manager to thank him for the shout-out. He had no idea that at that very moment, Mötley Crüe was desperately searching for a new singer. So John was invited to the audition. After a couple jam sessions, he got the job. He was the new frontman for one of rock's biggest bands on the planet. But there was a catch. He had to keep it a secret. The band had just signed a massive $25 million contract with Elektra Records, a deal that was predicated on the classic lineup, with Vince Neil on the vocals. So legally, they were in a pretty screwy position. So Corabi becomes the band's secret weapon, holed up in the studio as they begin to forge a new identity. With Corabi on board, the band's sound underwent this radical transformation. They leaned into that heavier, darker, more aggressive style, drawing inspiration from the very grunge bands that had inadvertently torpedoed the Scream's career. Corabi's voice, a powerful, gravelly instrument, was a perfect fit for this new direction. Stark contrast to Neil's signature high-end snare. And the energy in that room was electric. For the first time, Mötley Crüe's lyrics moved beyond the usual rock and roll stuff of girls and parties. Corabi brought this new depth to the songwriting. He wrote a song called Uncle Jack, chilling, deeply personal track about the uncle who was mentioned earlier in this video, and it was a level of lyrical honesty and darkness that the band had never touched before. He was an active contributor, not just a hired gun, co-writing the music and pushing his new bandmates into this uncharted territory. The resulting album, self-titled Mötley Crüe, released in '94, was arguably the most musically complex and mature record of their career. And it's true, you listened to it and it was real and raw. It wasn't trying to be anything. Some critics hailed it as a masterpiece, a really bold, creative leap for the group. But the fans, and more importantly, the record label, didn't exactly agree. Elektra Records was absolutely pissed off that Vince Neil was gone. They had paid for the circus and they got a serious, introspective rock album instead. So they kind of half-heartedly promoted it. The band's relationship with MTV, the crucial partner in their 80s dominance, completely imploded after Nikki Sixx threatened to assault a host during an interview, leading the band to storm off the set. The video for their song Smoke in the Sky, which lyrically dealt with pot legalization and took shots at political figures, was deemed too controversial and received little to no airplay. It's funny, things like that actually happen on YouTube as well, but just another repeat of an earlier time. The album was a commercial catastrophe. The previous album, Dr. Feelgood, sold over 5 million copies in the US, and this self-titled Corabi-fronted album barely scraped past 500,000. So sales-wise, it was a stunning, humiliating failure, even if the album kicked ass. And the tour was even worse. This was Mötley Crüe, a band accustomed to selling out stadiums and arenas around the world. Now they were playing to what Corabi would later describe as oceans of empty seats in half-filled theaters and clubs. The financial bleeding was so bad that dates were eventually canceled. Nikki Sixx tried to spin it as a deliberate choice, claiming that they were losing money because they're having fun and reclaiming their artistic freedom, but the reality was undeniable. The project was a disaster. And through it all, John Corabi became the public face of that failure. The easy target, the scapegoat for every single thing that went wrong. And to a legion of angry fans, he was the guy who broke up their favorite band. To the industry, he was the guy who couldn't sell records. He was blamed for the album's performance, even as the tectonic plates of the music world shifted under their feet. Their own label had actually worked against them. Despite the external chaos, the band soldiered on, returning to the studio to begin work on their next album, which would eventually become Generation Swine. For over a year, Corabi poured his heart and soul into the new material, co-writing nearly 80% of the songs. He believed that they're creating something really special, another step forward in that evolution, but he had no idea that he was basically writing his own eulogy. And the end came out without warning. No meeting, no phone call, no goodbye. He found out through the grapevine that Vince Neil was back in the band. And just like that, his 5-year journey was over. The band's manager, Alan Kovac, laid out the cold, hard truth. Elektra Records had delivered an ultimatum. The label refused to fund the next Mötley Crüe album unless Vince Neil was singing on it. And as Kovac bluntly put it to Corabi, I don't give a fuck if Paul McCartney was fronting this band, it's not what they paid for. They want Vince Neil or they're doing nothing. And the betrayal? Absolute. The final insult was yet to come. When Generation Swine was finally released in 1997, Corabi's voice had been almost entirely scrubbed from the record. Vince Neil had re-recorded most of the vocals, and Corabi, who had co-written the vast majority of the album, received credit on only 2 of the tracks. A year of John's life work had been effectively stolen and erased. Devastated and furious, he filed a $4 million lawsuit against Mötley Crüe and Elektra Records for breach of contract, copyright fraud, defamation. The lawsuit made a few headlines and then, like his time in the band, simply vanished without a trace. No public trial, no apology or acknowledgement. He was left out in the cold, professionally and personally just shattered. And then for years, Corabi was treated like a pariah. The doors that had flown open for him just a few years earlier would now slam shut. He was perceived as damaged goods, the guy who failed Mötley Crüe, or even worse, the guy who sued Mötley Crüe. And so he battled a pretty deep funk, questioning everything about his talent and his future. He had been given his golden ticket and it had turned to ash in his hands. It felt like his voice no longer mattered. But the same resilience that got him through his childhood carried him through this. He had to rebuild his career from scratch. So in 1997, he formed the band Union with former Kiss guitar player Bruce Kulick, another musician who knew what it felt like to be unceremoniously dumped by a legendary band. They released a couple raw, honest rock albums that were praised by fans and critics, finding a loyal audience who really dug the authenticity. He went on to sing for Ratt for a time, play guitar in Brides of Destruction, though his difficult relationship with Tracy Guns cut that gig short. Then in 2015, he found a new home, fronting the international supergroup the Dead Daisies. For 4 years, he toured the world and recorded several acclaimed albums with them, finally finding the stability and respect that had eluded him. He left in 2019, admitting the maniacal touring schedule was just burning him out. He had to be with his family. But he would later rejoin them in 2023 on his own terms. The ultimate slap in the face came in 2019 with the release of the Mötley Crüe biopic, The Dirt. In the film's telling of the band's history, John Corabi's entire 5-year tenure, the album, the tour, the drama, was almost completely erased from the script. He was a footnote, and he was really pissed off, stating publicly, "I'm not asking to be celebrated, I just want the damn truth. The truth is I saved that band from falling apart, and yet they rewrote the story like I never existed." It was the final confirmation that his former bandmates were determined to bury that chapter of the history forever. So he eventually told his own side of the story in his 2022 autobiography, aptly titled Horseshoes and Hand Grenades. The name says it all. His entire career has been a series of near misses, of being close but never quite hitting the jackpot. But John Corabi insists his legacy isn't defined by platinum records or industry awards. In this case, it's defined by his persistence and that refusal to be silent. He sees himself more as a storyteller, a survivor whose music is a direct line to his soul, an unfiltered voice in a business that chews people up and spits them out.